I guess we are live.
Okay.
We're live. Welcome. So again, I'm Pooja Talkacharla, co-organizer with John Orrin for the GW Ethics in Publishing Conference. This is our 11th session, and we're thrilled that you're all with us. I'm very pleased to introduce our first session for the conference, Dianndra Roberts of the Royal College of Psychiatrists and Shaina Lange with the American Chemical Society. They're going to start us off with a presentation on inclusion and identities in the publishing workplace. Deandra, I'll let you get us started.
Thank you, Pooja, for that lovely welcome. I'm just going to share my slides with everyone. Can we all see the slides? Lovely. Okay, so thank you and hello, everyone. I am Dianndra Roberts, Senior Publishing Coordinator for the Royal College of Psychiatrists. Today, I will be speaking on the concept of othering and discussing how we can use inclusive language. So, othering is a phenomenon in which some individuals or groups are defined and labeled as not fitting in within the norms of a social group. It is an effect that influences how people perceive and treat those who are viewed as being a part of the in-group versus those who are being seen as part of the out-group. Othering is not a new concept. Largely in society, white is considered the baseline for normality in terms of social groups, as is heteronormative practices. Grouping people has been a social practice considered as an easy way of identifying people. However, what we know now is that it has led to a number of biases and discrimination within society, including in the workplace, leading to communities being marginalized and often unable to reach what should be attainable goals that were accessible to their peers. With othering, what should be considered normal experiences are often penalized or discriminated. So I'm going to talk a bit about biases. So bias is a prejudice in favor of or against one thing, person, or group compared with another, usually in a way that's considered to be unfair. So the terms conscious and unconscious bias have become more prevalent in the past few years, with unconscious bias most commonly coming into play at the workplace and is a wider factor of why people feel they cannot be wholly themselves in these surroundings for fear of being penalized due to their culture, background, religion, or sexuality. Unconscious biases are usually an internal exercise of trying to place people into boxes based on our perceptions or social stereotypes of that community. So this is where othering is the actionable term of an unconscious bias. So this can be harmful to ourselves and to those we might be projecting on. This is why accountability is an important part of allyship. So I'm going to go into more detail of the types of unconscious biases. So there's microaggressions, a term first coined by Harvard psychiatrist Chester Pierce in the 1970s. So microaggressions can be directed at members of any marginalized group, including but not limited to the LGBTQ plus community, women, and people with disabilities. Microaggressions, which do not mean small, by the way, it's micro as in an individual to an individual level, are broken down into three categories. So we've got micro assaults, micro insults, and micro invalidations. Micro assaults are more obvious and deliberate discriminatory behaviors, such as a security guard deliberately following a Black customer or telling a racist joke in a group. And micro insults and micro invalidations, on the other hand, tend to be unconscious, unintentional, and less obvious. There are even well-intentioned perpetrators of micro insults who often believe they're being complimentary when they're not. For example, telling a person of color, "You're surprised by how well-spoken and articulate they are." That is not a compliment, although some people may try to pass it off as one. It is, however, important to say that everyone has unconscious biases and it doesn't make you a bad person. But we can all be better people by listening, learning, and having the uncomfortable conversations to take our biases from unconscious to acknowledged and then a work in progress. And this is one of the reasons why intersectionality is an important tool to use and is a reminder to be inclusive and understand that experiences are different for everyone. And we cannot ask people to choose parts of their identity that could be a factor of bias. It's also a reminder that we cannot police whether someone is facing a bias or not, as we are not living in their experience. So protected characteristics. So this is the UK. Protected characteristics are a part of the Equality Act, ensuring that characteristics such as race, gender identity, religion, age, disability, and sexual orientation are not discriminated against in their daily lives. Many countries across the world have acknowledged protected characteristics in some way through policies or human rights laws. Discrimination can fall into the following categories, such as direct discrimination, which is being treated worse than others in a similar situation due to your characteristics or part of who you are. Indirect discrimination is when a policy or a way of working applies to everyone, but could disadvantage those who are within a protected characteristic. For example, a policy relating to racism in the workplace, noting specifically African American colleagues as opposed to Black colleagues. This could be a loophole in indirect discrimination or harm when speaking to an actual whole race rather than ethnicity of people. It's also important to change language, as African American is a valid identifier. However, it does not cover all colleagues from Black backgrounds, as I just mentioned. Another example is a policy stating a one-way system in the workplace, which is not functional for those with accessibility requirements. So this policy is displaying able-bodied thinking as a baseline for all employees. Harassment is when colleagues may be made to feel humiliated, offended, or degraded based on their experiences and their differences. So this is a common outcome in regards to practices of othering, where marginalized groups are considered as less than and are victimized for speaking up on this mistreatment. So pronouns are identifiers used in place of names, but they are just as significant in validating a person's experience. We need to ensure we are saying people's names correctly first and foremost, and according to their preference. It is okay to ask someone how to pronounce their name, but it is not okay to make a joke about it because you are unsure or uncomfortable. We also need to ensure we are using the correct pronouns for everyone, and this is also okay to ask if you're unsure. It has become increasingly common to display personal pronouns in work environments via email signatures or profile names, for example. This is a positive change in acknowledging personal identifiers, and we must respect them. Gendered pronouns were considered the norm up until recently, where there has been a rising impact from LGBTQ+ rights movements and organizations such as Stonewall, who are working to change policy and have more inclusive language in society, particularly in the workplace. At present, we can do more to ensure our language and dialogue across policies, communications, etc., is not only gender neutral, but moves away from heteronormative practices in how we address our peers, represent our environments, and how we collect data. Consider using gender decoder systems or companies who can support balancing out language when making statements or advertisements, or just general addressing of those in your work environment to ensure that you are as far-reaching and as fair as possible. So ethnicity and race have become more intertwined regarding identities over the years. However, there are times when we need to be aware of the differences when addressing different groups. In the US, BIPOC, BIPOC, also Black, Indigenous, and people of color has become a frequently used catchment term with similarities to BAME or BAME, which stands for Black, Asian, and Minority Ethnics, which is used in the UK and Europe more so, as well as POC in the US and ethnic minority in the UK. So we have to be aware that although these terms are essentially meaning of the same thing, they do have a different understanding in different areas, and some may translate further than others, depending on where we are and who our audiences that we're speaking to. The term global majority is also becoming used more often across the world when discussing those from Black, Asian, and ethnic backgrounds. These terms stand to serve as an identifier for those who are essentially not white. Although it has its benefits, it too can remove the individuality or humanity of those we are addressing if we are putting them all into the same group when they have all had very different experiences. When addressing those on a wider scale, e.g. globally or internationally in terms of comms and things like that, it is more suitable to address the communities by race directly, if appropriate, to ensure that it is clearer and further reaching our understanding of the conversation at hand. I say all this to say there's no absolutely right or wrong, but we must think with person-centered approaches and ensuring we are validating people's identities rather than grouping all identities into one larger other category. So some things to consider during peer review. Although peer review is a standard practice globally, we should consider what is offered at publisher levels and how we are addressing equity within the system. For publications that have an international reach, we have to be aware that not all our authors will be native English speakers or writers, yet they will often be critiqued on their English skills. We have to consider whether we are offering any support in the area to shorten the barrier to publication and aid the language gap. Reviewers also need to be trained on potential biases, where they could be placing a barrier on publications due to conscious and unconscious biases regarding protected characteristics or language. There needs to be an even greater focus on the concept of sound research. Is the reviewer feedback clear to the authors who are non-native English speakers? Have we considered cultural norms when responding to our authors? It's best to keep feedback to the point and clear if offering recommendations so that it is understood what is being asked of the authors and where they stand during the peer review process. Ethnically diverse representation at the top table increases productivity by 31%, ensuring that there is representation of the macrocosm on editorial boards and within reviewer pools will strengthen the publishing material and continue to close barriers at publication. As mentioned earlier, gender-neutral guidelines and communications need to be the norm and move away from heteronormative language. This will increase inclusivity and trust. We also need to consider data collection. Are we asking the right questions? When collecting equality data, are we giving the option to select non-binary? Are we asking for sex and gender? Why are we asking for those things? Are we covering ethnic diversity of our authors? Have we accounted for Arab backgrounds, mixed heritage, the Latinx community? And are we still heavily utilizing the use of other? So individual level changes. These are great keys to getting started. We cannot speak on what we don't know. And the best way to understand is from those who are living the experience. We have to ensure we do our part in educating ourselves and to be better and more aware of how we could unintentionally be othering those around us. We need to keep our practices in mind and keep the conversation going to ensure the change is on the agenda, which will ultimately aid a more welcoming environment. These are all steps to ensuring the workplace is fit for all, mentally and emotionally, to allow people to be their most authentic self. And we must do everything we can with intentional actions. So some institutional level changes is to check your communications and resources for inclusive language. Oftentimes we have resources, information and content that has been written years ago and rarely updated on public spaces such as websites and leaflets. When was the last time you checked for information for authors? We need to ensure that we are continually checking this for the correct language and terminology. It might take time to grasp the constantly changing language, but by staying informed, it will be so much easier. How clear is the information for authors' pages, and are they written with a global understanding? Have they been road tested by users from other countries who may not have the same understanding of the English language? These are things to consider for inclusive language checks. So also next is to audit your boards and committees. Are they representative of society? Do they make room for inclusivity? Is there clear data on the makeup of your teams, boards, and organizations? All questions to consider. If you're using focus groups, are you doing everything you can to make them as reflective as possible? By keeping an eye on the data, you are giving yourself the position to be held accountable. Make goals for change that you need to answer to and ensure that you are keeping this at all levels. Question your recruitment practices. Are they largely recommendation-based? Largely when recruiting voluntary roles, there is a practice of selecting those who have been recommended within trusted circles. In publishing, many editorial boards are filled with recommendations from other board members. Although this quickly solves the lulls in any recruitment, it is not the most inclusive. We often reflect ourselves in those we would recommend. It is not uncommon to feel more comfortable around those who represent us, but this continually puts marginalized groups on the outs. If there is a true call for inclusivity, which means proactive diversity, we have to change how we set the system. Do you have the opportunity to grow experiences of those within underrepresented groups? If the answer is yes, put in the work and make those changes. Remove hard to reach from your vocabulary. Look further afield. Be proactive in finding communities you are not in contact with. Hard to reach is a term we hear far too much and far too often. Myself, as a working class Black woman with chronic health issues, is considered hard to reach. No, I'm not. I've always been there. I have spent many a time in my early career knocking on doors to be seen, but I was not in anyone's eye line. We need to remove hard to reach from our vocabulary and consider the questions of where am I not looking? Who am I looking for? And what circles would they be in? How best can I address those spaces and ask for help? Expand your networks. Do not be afraid to build new ones if the current ones are not fit for purpose. It is never, ever a condition of somebody being hard to reach. That being said, there will be times where you will try and the response might not be what you expected, but you tried and then you need to keep going and you need to keep trying. Word of mouth, like recommendation, is powerful, and after time, people will begin to approach you. Make time to learn about societal differences and how this can affect your practices at all levels. We live in a multicultural society, so we need to be mindful of everyone's differences, which so often are a strength in the workplace. Make time to educate yourself on biases, terminologies, how different social situations are perceived. Have you ever considered how daunting the workplace can be for your one Black colleague? Or someone who is trying to conceal their sexuality for fear of their safety, or someone living with disability navigating an able-bodied workspace. Being kind is key, and we can do better when we know better. Take active time to read literature in this area, watch documentaries, reflect on how you can have a positive impact using your platform you have been given. And then lastly, sense check. This is something that we all do throughout our lives. It's an important opportunity to take a step back and ask, why am I doing this? Is it because I've always done this? Have we consulted anyone that may have lived experience that could give us a better understanding? Do we need to? Again, sense checking is just a reminder to hold yourself to account. So thank you for listening. You can find me on LinkedIn, and this is my email address if you'd like to get in touch. So I think I'm going to pass on to Shaina.
Thank you, Deandra. I'm just going to share my screen. Can you confirm if you can see that?
No.
All right, one more time. Okay. There we go. All right, sorry about that. Hello, everyone. My name is Shaina Lange. I work in the Publishing Integrity Office at ACS Publications, supporting our journals program. And I'm really pleased to be part of the GW Ethics in Publishing Conference this year. The first time I attended the conference was actually as a student of the Master's of Professional Studies program several years ago. So it's great for us to kind of come full circle. In the publishing industry, we are starting to look at some of the policies and practices that we have in place for authors, reviewers, and editorial contributors, much to what Deandra was just pointing to. We're asking ourselves if there are any barriers to success for certain groups of people. How do we eliminate or help eliminate those barriers? And furthermore, what else can we do to support those communities? And one topic that has come up quite a bit recently is the idea of changing identities and specifically changing one's name after publication. I'll be giving some background today on why inclusive author name change policies are important within the research ecosystem, some guidance for creating an inclusive policy, and touch on future considerations. So I want to start off by discussing the why such policies are important. And I think as a society publisher, much of that comes from our mission and our core values. At the ACS, we're actively committed to cultivating a diverse, equitable, inclusive, and respectful community of chemistry professionals. We have a core value, which is DEI and R, the R being respect. And that core value embodies our commitment to embrace and advance inclusion in chemistry, where all researchers have the tools and opportunities to succeed. So we aim to promote DEIR in everything we do, identifying and dismantling barriers to success and creating a welcoming and supporting environment for everyone to thrive. So to this end, we look to building sustainable processes for addressing inequities in the scientific community. We know, too, that a researcher's opportunities for professional advancement depend heavily on their publication history. We also know that any researcher over the course of their career may change their name for many reasons, such as gender identity, marriage, divorce, religious conversion, caste, refugee status, or any other personal circumstances or preferences. And these varies can extend beyond this list here, but we know that name changes disproportionately affect women and transgender, non-binary, and gender diverse researchers. And these are groups that are already underrepresented and face inequities in academia. I think it's important to note that these changes may not always occur through traditional legal processes. Not only are legal name changes costly and a lot of cumbersome paperwork, they require a lot of time and effort and can take months or more to be processed completely. And particularly in sensitive circumstances, this can put a great emotional toll on the person. In my work in author name change policies, I learned recently that in some states in the United States, for example, changing one's legal name requires public-facing disclosure, such as in your local newspaper or posted at your city hall. And that can include the reason for the name change, the previous name and the new name, as well as sometimes even the person's home address. And so these legal requirements can create obvious privacy and personal security concerns and can be another hurdle in changing one's name legally. And until recently, publishers have been guided by authorship policies that were unintentionally harmful to researchers who changed their name. Many publishers, ACS included, are guided on authorship issues by the Committee on Publication Ethics, or COHE. And specifically for author name changes, there was a 2013 COHE forum, which is essentially when members get together and discuss a case and make a recommendation. And there was a 2013 case where an author wanted to change their name on an article because it had indicated their caste, which is fairly common, particularly in South Asian countries. And the COHE forum was ultimately divided on whether or not the name change should be allowed. You can read, I think, the actual case and the discussion online on the COHE website, but the discussion essentially was kind of involved needing legal proof of the name change as well as a public correction. There was discussion around how to validate that the person was who they said they were. And so ultimately the recommendation that came out of that COHE forum was that due to lack of a convincing reason for the name change, the request should be denied. And these types of restrictive policies prioritize the integrity of the record, which is a lot of the motivator if you do read that COHE discussion, especially when we were printing everything. You know, it made sense. In order to correct a record, you couldn't necessarily go back and correct something in print. You'd have to issue a correction. And it also safeguarded against fraudulent activity, someone potentially wanting to claim someone else's work. And so these policies involved publishing a correction or erratum, getting permission from co-authors, as well as legal proof of the change, or at least some type of quote unquote convincing reasoning. And such policies left researchers who had changed their names with kind of two poor options. They could include all of their past publications on their CV, which would mean sharing past identities with potential employers and collaborators. And for transgender researchers in particular, that forces them to out themselves by sharing their previous name, as well as opening themselves up for discrimination and other personal harm. And so the alternative is to abandon previous work published under their past name, which can have negative effects on their professional mobility. So I'm pleased to say that in December 2020, COHE actually made a note to that 2013 case stating that they're working on updated guidance. And in the meantime, that case should not be used to deny the rights of authors who request name changes. And so publishers in the last 2 years or so have been moving toward more inclusive policies. And inclusive policies really center the author and their right to privacy while leveraging technologies to maintain the record. So these involve a silent or invisible update. There's no notice that calls attention to the change. The author has full autonomy of the change, so it doesn't require any type of permission or notification to anyone else. And there's no legal proof of the change. So recognizing that, again, not everyone takes that path and does not require any type of reason to be shared. So ACS Publications was called to action on Twitter by a transgender chemist and advocate, Irving Reddig, who was personally dealing with the challenges of having their previous name on their past publications and CV. We ended up engaging with Irving directly, who had been advocating in this space for a while, to hear his experience and thoughts on the topic. And Irving and other advocates in this space helped directly shape ACS's policy, and I know those of a lot of other major publishers. And they formed a name change policy working group who's now collaborating with COHE to update their guidance on name changes. And that guidance, I think, is forthcoming, but there are 5 guiding principles that the working group has outlined in the interim. So one is accessibility. Name changes should be an option available to authors upon request without legal documentation, reason, or other unnecessary barriers. 2 is comprehensiveness. All instances of an author's previous name should be replaced, maintained, and disseminated by the publisher. 3 is invisibility. So name changes should not draw attention to the gender identity of an author or create any juxtaposition between the current name and the previous name. 4 is expediency and simplicity. So changes should be implemented swiftly. If an author submits a request, hopefully it doesn't take 6 months to a year for the change to actually appear online. And 5 is recurrence and maintenance. So once a name change has been implemented, there should be some degree of ongoing maintenance of the records to remove recurrences of the previous name. And these are the guiding principles that underpin our ACS policy and a lot of the other policies I've seen from other publishers. This is a highly simplified overview of our process, which I'll quickly walk through. So we use a form to gather all of the necessary information from the author. This we find minimizes unnecessary back and forth. We can get almost all of the information right off the bat in a consistent and clean way. And we certainly don't ask for legal proof or reason. We do need some verification of the person, but it's mostly kind of verifying their account so that we can pinpoint them in our system. So we require an updated profile in our submission system and a link to ORCID ID before processing any request. And this measure serves as a verification step while also protecting the entirety of an author's literature in relation to their persistent identifier. So once we have all the necessary information, we then send the request out to any relevant teams. So beyond updating their articles, if the author is an ACS member, for example, or an editor, then we send the request out to our membership support or other teams so that those records can also be updated. For updating the article, the production team then makes relevant changes to names, pronouns, salutations, initials, any other references to the author in the body of the manuscript. That also includes email addresses that might be in the metadata. And we've recently started encountering images as well. And these changes are made to the HTML and PDF versions of a publication and the metadata. We then republish the article on our platform and resupply it to third parties. And this is where we run into one of our major limitations. So we can update an author's name across most ACS systems. We can redeliver that information downstream to third parties, but we can't control the use or the appearance of an author's name on non-ACS products or content. And we can't necessarily guarantee that that update is going to propagate to those downstream environments, even if we provide them. We do address this risk by being transparent in our frequently asked questions to the author community, and also giving them the option of, if they do want to go the route of issuing a correction, that always remains an option for them. I think really critical throughout this process is that the author is kept up to date, that they're made aware of any potential delays or issues that we might run into. That communication is open in case we have any questions directly for them, and that they need to make decisions on them rather than us making those decisions on their behalf. And that they also feel supported. So throughout our workflow, we avoid the author being asked for the same information multiple times. To emphasize the importance of that to staff, to make sure that we're using their current name. We held gender inclusivity information sessions for all staff in our publications division, but really targeted towards our staff who would be directly supporting this policy. And those sessions were led by a transgender researcher, Isaac Blythe. And Isaac shared their experience as a trans researcher and educated staff on some of the challenges that they faced, both as a person and throughout their research career. They also trained staff on how we can better support that community during the name change process and beyond. So even particularly for our customer service support staff, for example, making sure that you are not assuming anyone's pronouns right off the bat, not using their previous name, making sure that you're using the current name, making sure that you're getting all that information right up front, that they know who to contact from the beginning, they're not bounced around from person to person. I'm very encouraged by the work that publishers are doing in this space. Almost every week, I feel like I see another publisher announcing an inclusive name change policy. I think many of us have been learning and adjusting as we encounter new situations. And at ACS, I know we continue to enhance our policies so that they best serve our authors. There is a lot of opportunity for further collaboration to improve publisher adoption, as well as create consistency in standards and processes. I think consistent practices and expectations around timing, for example, will only help to reduce the burden on authors and further support their needs. There are a lot of industry initiatives to share information and help develop guidelines. Similarly, I think there's an opportunity for authors' institutions to better support authors' needs in this regard. A few months ago, the U.S. National Laboratories, which is run by the U.S. Department of Energy, announced their name change policy, whereby lab administrators would submit name change requests on their researchers' behalf. And so the lab administration would be the one liaising with the publisher, directly filling out any forms, all of that. And several publishers, including the ACS, partnered with the national labs to enable such requests. And I expect to see other institutions following suit. At a higher level, I think these inclusive policies have reinforced the need to shift from names as an individual identifier and a unit of attribution. This is something that the name change policy working group is definitely pushing for and advocating. It's highlighted the value of persistent digital identifiers such as ORCID that can be dynamically tied to an individual regardless of whether they undergo a name change or institution change. I think we're also thinking about how else can we support author autonomy and expression of identity throughout the peer review process. What else needs to change to support a more equitable process for everyone? And I would also, recommend going beyond what existing practices need to change and really start thinking about what new services or programs can we create to help underrepresented groups succeed. And I think Deandra pointed to several potential changes already. And last but not least, I think there's always room for continued growth, conversation, and collaboration in this space. By listening to different perspectives, going outside of ourselves, I think we're only allowing ourselves as individuals and as an industry to grow and be proactively inclusive moving forward. Thank you so much for listening. You can read more about ACS's name change policy or other DEI initiatives by visiting publish.acs.org. And I'm happy to connect with anyone interested and also happy to answer any questions.
Dianndra and Shaina, thank you so much for that very precise and comprehensive discussion about name change. So Shaina, you mentioned ORCID IDs, and I actually have a question concerning sort of the role of publishing as a mechanism that makes scholarship or original ideas permanent. When it comes to name changing, how do DOIs, how are they handled when it comes to reflecting past publications and name changes?
So it's a good question. So the DOI itself is completely kept intact. And what we're doing with ORCID IDs is really just being able to tie in that DOI and that article to the individual, regardless of their name or affiliation changing at all. So I think if anything, the idea of just persistent identifiers when it comes to an individual is still tied to the persistent identifier as an article using the DOI.
I figured it would have a pretty scientific explanation. We're open for questions from the participants. I know that there's quite a few of you here listening in. So if you want to frame a question in the question box, I'd be happy to intercept it and share it with our speakers today. Well, you guys are all speaking up at once. It's actually very quiet. I'll ask one more question then. This is for Deandra. So Deandra, you were discussing that there are different mechanisms that are used for addressing minority populations and the naming conventions. And obviously, in the English-speaking world, there's a certain amount of reciprocity that I think would make sense. But have you personally encountered a lot of kind of things that get lost in translation when it comes to creating a more inclusive environment for people of all cultures in international work? Is Deandra still
Guys, I did not unmute myself. Can you see me okay?
I think so. We can hear you though.
Okay, my camera's meant to be on, so sorry about that. Yes, I have experienced that. I've experienced it myself. Working internationally as a Black British woman, and I've also had to be mindful of it when encountering other people. I think one thing that I can speak for that happens in the UK a lot is the use of the term BAME or BAME, as some people put it down to. I prefer not to use these terms as a word because it removes the humanity of the cultures that are within that, and then it makes them seem as one thing. We are not a monolith, so we need to keep in mind that there are different people within those words, those terms. So yeah, it's just ensuring that when you can be specific. If people prefer to be referred to as a certain way, some people don't like being called an ethnic minority, especially in the UK. It's not necessarily seen as a nice thing. So it's just knowing your audience, who you're speaking to and who you're trying to approach, and how they prefer it. I think it's just best to go with the cultural norms, well, accepted based on your group. I don't know if that answered your question at all.
It did. I mean, it's a tricky question because so much of creating an inclusive environment, in my experience, is having this terminology as an identifier, but then not binding ourselves or other people to this monolithic, you're a minority or you're BIPOC. Or, I mean, they're really helpful structurally, but they're not the most humane kind of experientially.
Absolutely. I usually say use them for statistical purposes, but don't use them as a means of trying to identify a person because they are a person. If we're not doing it for other people and other cultures, in terms of we don't usually box white people. I'm just saying it as it is. So why are we trying to do that for other ethnicities when we could easily speak of them with the fullness that they do have in their culture?
Amen. We have a couple questions here. One is from Kelly Church, and she's asked, can you go over recurrence and maintenance as specific terms one more time? Thanks for your question, Kelly.
Yeah, thank you, Kelly. Yeah, so this is actually one of the guiding principles from the name change policy working group who's working with COHE. And that recurrence and maintenance is that once the change has been actually implemented, that there is some responsibility from the publisher to kind of have ongoing maintenance of the record. So if there's another instance where the previous name, for example, is perpetuated or crops up, that the publisher is able to kind of rectify that. At the ACS, one of the things that we've done to kind of work towards this is, so if someone changes their name, and because it is kind of silent and invisible, the one thing that we can't control necessarily is other people citing someone's dead name, for example, or their previous name. If they're not made aware, and many researchers are not comfortable with sharing that they've changed their name to their collaborators. So there is a possibility that someone might cite their previous name unknowingly. And so one of the things that we do within our system is if that reference comes through in another ACS article, we are able to make sure that it's referencing the correct and updated name if they've submitted and updated a name change request through us. I think there's probably still, and the article from the name change policy working group points to some of this. I think there's still room for kind of a larger infrastructure change from publishers. That's what we're doing is probably one small part of that, and we do have a way of kind of doing that automatically. But that maintenance, I think, could become potentially labor intensive for a lot of publishers. And so it's, I think, a future consideration as well.
Thank you, Shaina. We've got another question here from Joe Luber saying, and I'm just going to read it verbatim, can you talk more about naming changes and findability, especially if bibliographic records of a single work exist with both current affirmed names and previous names in various places?
Yeah, so this is something that I wish I could maybe answer more fully, but I think, again, this is something that probably requires more kind of industry and infrastructure change. I think it is an issue that if you are not aware that your collaborator's name has changed, you might be searching or again citing their work under their previous name. We do, and I think many other publishers do, kind of feed that updated data into third-party indexing services like Web of Science, PubMed, Scopus, and we have been seeing a lot of that propagating in kind of due time. But I think you still do run the risk of that work still being out there under their previous name. I don't necessarily have an answer, but I know one of the things that we have thought about at the ACS is even in our publication search, for example, if you go to our website, would a researcher who's changed their name ever want, if you search for their current name, would it also maybe bring up anything under their previous name and vice versa? And part of what we don't really have a solution to that, and we haven't moved forward with that. And part of that is around privacy concerns that as the name change policy working group has outlined, is we really want to minimize any juxtaposition between the previous name and the current name. And so even enabling that in the search, there's a lot of positives for findability, but that also then creates that juxtaposition that we're trying to avoid. And in some situations, a researcher might not want that. So we don't have a solution, at least at the ACS. I would love to connect with any other publishers who are considering kind of those similar findability issues, but it's a great question.
And Shaina, while we have you on, we have a question specifically from you from Chanel George, who says, hi, Shaina. Regarding the ACS's simplified process, will you please elaborate a bit more on the information and requirements identified step?
Sure. So this is after the author submits the form, which we have in place, which anybody can check out within our policy online. We basically, our customer service team receives that form and essentially makes sure that all of the information on there is complete. All of the fields are completed, for example, and that they're completed kind of comprehensively, that we have the information that we need. The actual identity verification, as I mentioned, is really just about making sure that we have their email address in our system. Oftentimes, too, someone might have multiple accounts in our submission system for a variety of reasons. So part of that step is actually our internal team trying to see, do we need to maybe merge those accounts, and taking kind of steps to get there. But that step is really about making sure that the form itself is complete and we have all the information we need to send it out to the teams.
That's great. Thank you. And just a kind of a housekeeping thing for those of you listening, if you want to post questions for our speakers, either Shaina and Deandra in this session or any future sessions, do post them in the session specifically, because that way I can see it versus in the external chat. So we've got one more question here from Allegra Swift, and I'll read it verbatim. Do you provide workshops and education for your peer reviewers and editors, or an avenue for prospective authors to bring up any issues with their experience with peer reviewers or editors or even the publisher? So do you have workshops helping to sort of educate your peer reviewers, and is there a code of conduct that you ask peer reviewers to adhere to when they're working with you?
Is that for either of us? Or?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm talking, so I guess I'm okay to go first. Yeah, we do have a code of conduct for peer reviewers across books and journals. We've recently started a program on creating a new pool of reviewers. So we're using that as a means to get more inclusivity in the reviewer pool, but also how they can best approach reviews across the journals, because they were quite different. And we have put a resources page up, including sort of things that I mentioned earlier in terms of like biases and how to look more at sound research over critiquing the little things that we know we can get out. We do also use a company to help us, well, help authors with their English written language if they are not native English speakers, and we do make reviewers aware. So that comes up as a stamp when they submit, so that it does say it's gone through Rightful, which is what we use. So we are trying. I think there's definitely things we can do better and more of, but we have made a start. In terms of having a sort of workshop, I think that's definitely something in the works. We do a standard peer review workshop, but it could probably be fleshed out a bit more to include some of those points.
Yeah, and we have some similar programs at the ACS. We do have, it's called ACS Reviewer Lab, which is actually a free course, I believe, for reviewers. And there are a lot of different modules and topics covered on how to write a review, ethics and biases in the peer review process. And then to the second part of the question, an avenue for authors to bring up issues. We do have surveys that go out that we do receive feedback and are able to take action on a lot of that feedback. And one of the things actually that we're doing as part of our kind of recent accelerated DEI commitments as well is we're appointing an ombudsperson who would serve as kind of an independent liaison between the community and ACS editors. So if there is an issue, for example, or a complaint against an editor or a reviewer, particularly when there's potential bias involved, they're able to take those concerns to the ombudsperson and have it investigated kind of independently.
It's wonderful that these intentions and these initiatives have a real structured place to play out consistently in your workplace. So that's great to hear. We don't have any further questions, and so I just wanted to thank Deandra and Shaina for not only joining us, but starting off the conference and on such a positive note and showing such progress in these initiatives, because you got to start somewhere, and you've really given us the framework to continue. So thank you again for sharing your projects with us. For those of you at the conference, our next session starts in about 15 minutes at 1:15 Eastern Time. We're going to be talking about expanding inclusion and training on disabilities in ethics with Simon Holt and Emma Moles. So again, that's at 1:15 Eastern Time. That gives you a moment to get a cup of tea or whatever it is that you need. But thanks again for being here, and we will see you in the next session. Take care, guys. Thank you so much, Shaina. Thank you, Deandra.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.